Hello there, and welcome to Speaking of Our Words, radio programming that brings you the wide range of voices, stories, poems, and forms of local writers, and offers you some insight into their creative process. My name is Marshalll Smith. I'm your host. I'm a published poet and studied poetry in the MFA program at the University of Iowa Writers Workshop. We have several guest writers today. We have Darleen Coleman, Dave Gourdoux, and Robert Katzman. So why don't we get going? Darleen, if you would mind starting, that'd be great.
I will do that. Thanks, Marshall. I have a theme for my work today, and that is junk. My Harvest Gold blender finally gave up the ghost. Should I drive an hour and a half to walk through some dead person's junk to buy another vintage appliance? Not today. Today, I will sit on the patchwork quilt covering my sofa and ruminate. My boyfriend and I searched for a solid year before finding this sofa at the downtown Chicago Salvation Army, the best thrift store ever, with 3 or was it 4 floors loaded with cast-offs, remnants of others' lives in other houses, in other neighborhoods. The sofa was already quite old when it came to live with us. Now it's older still, recovered twice, in need of reupholstery again. It lives with just me now. So many years gone by, so many changes. Some things have not changed. I still cut my own hair, still make homemade soup on Sundays, still knit stuff I have no use for because I like the rhythm and clicking of needles in motion. I continue to prowl thrift stores, though in different, smaller towns. I live for estate sales, reverently creep through the houses of old people, dead people, as if entranced, infused with endorphins. Junk makes me happy. Some people grow old and glum, pack away their passions, not me. You'll have to pry mine out of my cold, dead heart. My passions, writing, reading, making art, and junking, make me happy and keep the juices flowing. Let's face it, we're all busy ants going about our day. Most of us never see the shoe coming, although at some point, usually around age 50, we start thinking about it a lot. I confess to wasting an exorbitant amount of time contemplating that shoe. To me, death is just a change of cosmic address. What frightens me is not being obliterated by the shoe, it's being rendered unable to continue being myself. My fear is of losing the ability to think, to remember, to do what makes me happy. Some days thoughts of never junking again stop me cold. I can't quite wrap my mind around it. My inclination towards solitude and inactivity are already affecting me from my bony knees to my knobbed fingers to my scarred, scared heart. I still smile at strangers, still find fascinating the shadows the blinds make across the bedroom wall on sunny days. Still love gazing up at the face on a brilliant, shining moon, but I'm not sure if it's from happiness or lonely wanting. I really can't see myself with anyone anymore. Oh, I drag out the ancient dream from time to time, finding the man who would adore me, complete me, help me lug home some really heavy junk. But what I have come to know is this: I am complete. And honest to God, I have managed to haul huge pieces of junk all by my lonesome. Maybe people can be alone for too long. Perhaps I have stepped over some edge I can't return from, but I am content. I am happy just as I am, so long as I am surrounded by my dogs, my books, my plants, and my junk. Stuff is safe. I can count on it. With junk, I am the one to decide when it's time to go. I'm the one in control, the one who loves, who chooses. Of course, there are drawbacks, limited funds, limited space. And of course, junk can't reciprocate my feelings for it. At least, I don't think so. Here's my current vision for the future. I see myself living in a cozy cottage by a lake, not the big lake, but one I can row across if I've a mind to. I'll have a little garden in front, wild with whatever flowers the wind plants. I'll line up shells and rocks on all the windowsills. The air will smell like the lake. The lake will be placid with gentle ripples. I'll have a couple of fat, lazy house cats, one of them gray. Maybe a dog, too, wildly speckled with golden eyes. I'll paint and write all day and read every evening. There'll be a little store across the lake, and on warm summer nights I'll row over to buy beer. Lightning bugs and the moon, my only light. I'll keep very few electric appliances. Perhaps another Harvest Gold blender. And what will I write about? What I've always written about. People whose hearts are out of alignment with their brains. People searching for their place in the world. What will I paint? Water. I'll paint the water and the wild flowers, the glint of sun on the clapboards. I'll paint myself in the middle of it all. And I'll paint cats, the dog, a cow, if one happens by. In the evenings, I'll sit amidst my junk and try to remember where I got each thing. I'll turn on the lamp and open a book, Wordsworth or Ferlinghetti or Joyce Carol Oates, one I've picked up at a thrift store for a song. And I'll sit in a big comfy chair, both cats on my lap, the dog at my feet, a steaming mug of peppermint tea at my side, and I will read and read and read, and when I look up, I'll revel in all my junk. Perhaps by then I'll have lavished such care and devotion on it, my junk will love me back.
Very nice, very nice. I enjoyed that quite a lot. So I noticed that you've created a new word, junking, or maybe that word exists some.
Oh, it definitely exists.
Okay, it's not one I knew. And so it seems to me that inside of that very lovely piece that you've created kind of a metaphor around that junk of your life. And I was wondering if what inspired you to write that piece?
You know, I love old things, and I get attached to things and to past relationships, and I think about them obsessively at times, and that's where this piece came of, and also because my Harvest Gold blender really did break one day. And I had to replace it, and it was a question, you know, what do I do? Do I get another piece of junk to replace it? Or do I go to the next big box store and buy a real piece of junk?
I see.
Yeah.
I see. Very good. Very good. So, Darleen, just to I know you've been reading on these podcasts a number of times, but just for my own edification, perhaps, and our audience as well, how long have you been writing?
To the best of my knowledge, it started when I was in high school. And for a number of years, those years, I wrote some very dark, very dreadful poetry.
Were you reading Sylvia Plath?
Yes, as a matter of fact.
That was a joke, but
and,
on the other hand, it is dark.
Yeah, no. When I reread those pieces now, I mean, really, I laugh hysterically because they were so awful. But, you know, you have to start somewhere. And that's, you know, that's where my teenage brain was at that point in time. So.
Okay. And who were your early influences?
Well,
in writing,
this is after high school. I thought to myself, you know, I should probably read some authors that I've heard about, you know, that I've never really read before, and I went to the neighborhood library, and I picked up a book by William Saroyan because I had heard of The Human Comedy before. I had no idea what it was about or who he was, but I read it, and he transformed my world. I loved his writing so much. I went on to read everything he's ever written, and not only that, but the junking gene was firmly embedded in me at birth, and I went on to collect. I have nearly every one of his published works. Some first editions, too, I was lucky enough to get, although I didn't know I was getting them at the time. I wasn't looking for that. But now I know how valuable they may be.
Very good. That's quite interesting. So he transformed, I think that was your word, you as a person, as a writer. Do we see his influence in your work?
You know, It's hard to say because there have been many writers since Saroyan. I mean, when I first read Saroyan and I was writing papers for school, you could tell the influence at that point in time because I tried to write exactly as he was writing. But since then, I find, I get attached or attracted to certain authors, and inevitably, things rub off on me. I remember reading Anne Lamott once, and she has this habit of, most people when they're writing a sentence, they'll name maybe 3 things, like a boy, a cat, and a dog. She always did 4 things, and I thought, I'm going to do 4 things, and I picked that habit up. I've been reading a lot of Joyce Carol Oates now, and oh my, she's some very unusual writing styles, and
I would call her the first lady of American letters.
Yeah, and so I'm picking up things from her, and
she's a wonderful writer.
Yeah.
She's also really interesting to hear read. Have you ever heard her read?
I have not. Actually, the other night I was almost all the way through one of her novels, and I had to put it down. It was so dark and so violent at that stage of the novel that I broke up with Joyce Carol Oates. I thought I broke up with her, but I'm never reading her again. I can't read this kind of thing, And then the next day I thought, well, I've only got 50 more pages maybe to go in the book. Might as well read it through. And so I did, and the violence and ugliness stopped, and it went back to the way it was at the beginning of the novel, and I finished it, and I was like, okay, I'll see her again.
Good. Does she influence your work? Or is this
I'm
a
sure
recent...
she will.
I see, because it's fairly recent you picked up her books. She's only got about 40 novels to read.
44, yeah.
Okay. Very good. Okay, well, I think you have another piece there.
Okay.
A couple more, maybe?
Yeah. Well, this next one is a poem that actually is derived from the piece I just read about junk, and this one's called Old Things, which is another name for junk. Old things. My old loves, old things, pressed layers of longing frozen in time, in paint and wallpaper, waiting for the scavenger's wrinkled hands to peel and sink into the bittersweet tomb. Remnants chosen from other lives, other places, cast-offs like dandelion fluff, a cocoon of cellular memory in tomorrow's garbage, saviors in a cold and empty chamber, gardens wild with whatever flowers wind plants, boats to row across lakes guided by fireflies, old loves drift on lily pads, sink like stones rippling water, scattering the laughing moon. Each love, every single thing, left dazzling and swirling, a universe of memory bound by desire, trapped in things destined for landfills. My hands grip so tightly they shatter dreams.
Very nice, very nice. Now, that's sort of maybe a reduction of the previous piece to some extent. And so I'm curious about, I would have to examine it, but I'm not going to be able to right now. What sort of, did you pursue a particular form in that piece when you decide you're going to write this poem? How do you approach that?
Honestly, I don't know enough about poetry to use a particular form, one form over another. I just wanted to condense what I had in the prose piece and see what happened, and that's what happened.
I guarantee you there is form in there, so I'd like to go over it with you sometime.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah. So, what poets do you perhaps read? Do you read poets now?
I've never read a lot of poetry. I did read some when I was in my Italian phase, when I was in my 20s. I went through a very intense Italian phase where I convinced myself I was Italian, and I wore clothing that I thought looked Italian. Of course it wasn't. I ate only Italian food, drank Italian wine, played Italian music, took a class in Italian, and memorized, little bits and pieces of Italian poems or songs. Other than that, I do like the beat poets. I'm very fond of Ferlinghetti.
Okay.
He's probably my favorite. And Emiri Baraka, former Leroy Jones, yeah.
Okay, very good, very good. Well, that was a very nice piece, and it is they're companion pieces, I'd say, which is what you intended. It sounds like. What more do you have? You have a couple more.
Well,
here,
I have a piece. I've often thought of doing a junking blog, but I haven't yet because I'm too busy out junking. So, and also I'm lazy, and I don't know that I could keep it up. But I wrote this piece when I thought I might do a junking blog, and it would be like the introduction to my junk journal. And it's called Junk, Art, and the Right Light. When did it start for me? Perhaps at age 8. I have a vivid memory of my mom and me going out to the alley behind our apartment after the telephone man had been working at the top of a huge utility pole for hours. On the ground, all around the pole, were snippets of colored wires, a rainbow of beautiful wires. We gathered them up as though harvesting berries for a pie, stuffed them in our pockets, and carried handfuls more home. I don't recall either of us talking about what we'd do with the wires. What I do remember is a state of bliss at having captured these treasures. When I was a bit older, I had a cheap Instamatic camera, the kind with no adjustments whatsoever. I took pictures of rusted steel garbage cans. There was a group of 5 of them in our concrete backyard. They didn't smell too good, but their form and color were beautiful to me. I also took photos of clotheslines, brick walls, and old broken things people left in the alley. After high school, I graduated to taking photos of the L train station from underneath. The shadow patterns that light cast on the ground below were breathtaking. My favorite photos were of giant heaps of metal refuse along the Chicago River, which I shot from the bridge on Webster Avenue. I saw these glittering mountains of metal as city sculptures. To me, all these city objects were beautiful. I loved looking at them as much as I loved looking at nature: water, rocks, trees, sky. Bits of broken glass on the pavement sparkling in the sun inspired me to make city gems speak to me sharply in the eye, a construct of broken windshield glass and mirror bits glued onto an old window. To me, the key is perception. If you look at things in the right light, anything can be valued for its beauty. I think I have always loved junk, creating with the junk I found. Thanks, Mom, for teaching me to appreciate the ever-changing sky, tiny colored telephone wires, shopping at thrift stores, and collecting the stuff that stirs my heart.
Very nice, very nice. And is your mother alive?
She is not.
Okay.
She is not.
Well, perhaps she hears it anyway. You're thinking.
Maybe she does.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a lovely piece as well. I'm noticing how reflective you are in your work. A lot of inner reflections that are coming forth in your work, and that's quite lovely the way you share them with us. So I'm curious, as you became a writer and began writing, did it change you as a person in the way you look at the world?
Probably as much as anything else, does change you over time. It's funny because I went to art school, and in my mind, I had to choose between writing and making art. And I thought that way for a number of years. You could be one or the other, but you can't be both. And eventually I came, to my senses and thought, well, why not? Of course I can do both. And so I've been doing both since, and I'm happy with that. I'm happy with combining them. I combined both writing and art in one piece that I did once, and I was lucky enough to actually sell that one, so I think it was a good omen.
Very interesting. So would you say that one influences the other?
In a lot of ways, I think I'm trying to express a lot of the same things, just in different ways. But I think there is definitely a relationship between the art that I make and the writing that I do. I feel happier doing the process of art because it's easier for me. Just I enjoy the process more. Whereas with writing, I enjoy having written, but not the actual act of writing is torturous for me.
Torturous. That's interesting.
Yes.
Can you tell us more about that? I'm interested in that. Torturous.
Yeah, well, I'm not a terribly disciplined person, so to make myself write, I really have to kind of force myself, and then I play all kinds of mind games with myself. Well, if you write for 5 minutes, then you could do this, and it's kind of silly. But once I actually start writing and get into the flow of it, I'm okay. It's just getting there is awfully hard. Whereas with making a piece of art, I don't have that struggle. I enjoy, even when things go wrong, I enjoy the process a lot more.
That's the way you described some of that is interesting. So some people, I think, and it could be both ways. Sit down and with discipline say, I'm going to write every day between 10 and 12 or 10 and 3, or it's kind of like you practice the piano if you're becoming a concert pianist or whatever. And other people become inspired by certain things, and then they want to write because they want to write about that. And you can have both going on, and one can happen inside the other. It sounds like you probably have both going on.
Yeah, I'm not. I don't do well on a schedule, even if I'm the one imposing the schedule on me. I tend to resist it. I've tried writing on a schedule. So that doesn't work for me. And sometimes, yes, I'll be, usually when I'm out walking the dogs, I get all kinds of ideas for writing poetry, for instance. I mean, lines will come to me, or certain words, and I'll try to jot them down as soon as I get home. And but as far as stories, honestly, I never get whole ideas. I get just fragments of things, and I start writing with a fragment. And then a character will come to me and start speaking in their voice, and then the thing grows from there. And I feel as if I have absolutely no control over it. I'm just like the secretary, I think sometimes that somebody somewhere is channeling stuff through me. I don't feel I'm doing it.
I fully understand that. Yeah. Yes, that is really quite a wonderful experience, actually, when things just kind of channel and you're writing them down. I've had that experience myself as well. I think you have one more poem for us.
I have one more poem.
Great.
And of course, this is about junk also. And this is called Mine. The old woman stands at the curb, ecstatically claiming the junk pile. Yesterday, someone moved. Left remnants spread across the grass. She has dibs. A faded blue pickup cruises the block. The man and his Chevy have seen better days. Through the rolled-down window, the driver leers. The woman reaches to touch the edge of the pile. This, everyone knows, is junker's etiquette. Her claim has been staked. Now back off. She thinks the man's stupid, plenty old enough to know the rules of picking. She got here first. Still, he has the wheels. All ears perk at the screeching orange refuse truck belching and lurching down the street, adding yet another contender to the fight. Mine, the woman shouts, her fists in balls. The pickup driver flicks his cigarette onto the pile of junk, spits in her direction, and laughs. The orange grinder pulls alongside them. A skinny man springs from the door like a choreographed dancer and shouts, "Hey, move your truck, and you," he points at the old woman. "Better get out of the way. I have work to do, and this here is mine." The pickup driver sputters away, cursing. The woman wraps her arms around herself as if she's an ancient oak about to be felled, and a hippie tree hugger all rolled into one. The refuse driver shrugs and jumps back into the orange truck. There are many stops on his route, and he wants to be home for Jeopardy. Arms laden with junk, the woman's walk home is slow but sweet with victory.
Very nice.
Thank
Very
you.
nice. That was enjoyable to listen to. Very nice. More reflection from Darleen Coleman. Thank you very much for your lovely works, 4 pieces. And you sold a piece, you said. You may have read that on the podcast before, I don't know. Maybe you can bring...
It was actually a piece of art,
Oh,
but
I see.
there is writing involved in it. And yeah, I could bring that.
Good. I hope you will next time.
Thank you.
Very good. You are listening to Speaking of Our Words. And next we have Dave Gourdoux. Dave has
4 very short pieces.
4 very short pieces. So, Dave, if you would like to read those, that would be terrific.
Sure. This first one's called It's Snowing in Twinkletown. A little bit of background. I thought I'd try writing a children's story. My kids are grown, and it's been a while since I've been around small kids. But I was surprised how quickly I was able to shift back into their innocence and optimistic outlook. I imagine this could be quite good with the right illustrator. So here goes. It's snowing in Twinkletown. Look, in the village square. It's Mayor McBride. He's coming out of Miss Amanda's house of hospitality again. He sure does spend a lot of time at Miss Amanda's. Oh, no. He's fallen on the sidewalk. My, but it doesn't look slippery. Oh, well, it looks like he's going to take a nap there in the gutter of the village square. He sure must be tired. Look at the snow falling on him. He should be wearing more than just his underwear in this weather. Let's go over to Baker Street and see what wonderful treats Mr. Snodgrass has in his bakery today. Who's that man at the counter in a blue uniform talking to Mr. Snodgrass? Why, of course, it's Officer McSleaze. Officer McSleaze sure likes Mr. Snodgrass's donuts. But why is Mr. Snodgrass giving Officer McSleaze money? Shouldn't it be the other way around? And why is Mr. Davis from the health department standing outside in the cold? What could he be waiting for? Oh my, they sure are a silly mixed up bunch of people. Out on the edge of town in his trailer house, Eddie is hard at work. He is cooking something and it sure looks good. Whatever it is, it's nice and shiny. Look at the funny suit he's wearing while he cooks. He's even wearing a mask. But Eddie, it's not Halloween. Meanwhile, Hank is sitting outside. What's that in his arms? A rifle? Well, hunting season is over. Someone has to tell him because he keeps watching the road. Maybe he is waiting for a badger. Now a car comes down the road. Wait a minute, Hank. That's not a badger. Hank shouldn't be shooting at the car. The car looks like Mr. Green's car. Is that Mr. Green driving? See the car crash into the telephone pole. See the car catch fire. Oh, those sure are bright red and yellow flames. I guess we have to wait for Mr. Moeller, the town dentist, to tell us if that was Mr. Green driving the car or not. Someone should tell Miss Amanda about Mr. Green. Mr. Green used to have fun playing dress-up on Saturday nights at Miss Amanda's house of hospitality. His favorite thing was to dress up and pretend he was Miss Sprinkles. Golly, that was fun. Mayor McBride had fun when Mr. Green played dress-up, too. He just loved to play with Miss Sprinkles. Who will be Miss Sprinkles for Mayor McBride now? I'm sure that the mayor and Sheriff McSleaze will find someone in Twinkletown to take Mr. Green's place. It's snowing in Twinkletown. Isn't it pretty?
Very interesting, fun to listen to, humorous. So, Dave, what inspired you to write this?
I have no idea. I think
That's an honest answer.
Actually, it seemed like everybody and their brother were writing children's books. And part of me said, how difficult can it be to really write a children's book? So I was kind of rebelling against the trend, I guess. So I figured I'd write kind of a twisted one.
Very good. Very good. Great. So, Dave, you've written quite a few pieces and read quite a few on the podcast here as well before my time here. And I wanted to ask you a question that I asked Darleen as well. And how long have you been writing, first of all?
Well, it's a complicated question. In all earnesty, I've been writing seriously for about since I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 2005. That's But I always dreamed of it. I'd always wanted to write before then, and I tried. I had a few abortive attempts here and there, but I didn't really get serious about it until after I was diagnosed.
Do you think that diagnosis influenced your decision to start writing rather seriously, or with a lot more spending a lot more time at it?
Yeah, definitely. When you get diagnosed with a disease like Parkinson's, that's kind of degenerative, if that's the right word. Makes you sound like a degenerate.
Yes.
But the ticking of the clock becomes very loud, and you realize, become very conscious of the fact that you might not be able to do this for very long. So that definitely impacted my thinking when it came to writing.
Why writing and not, say, Darleen does art, painting, or why writing?
Well, when I was a kid, I was a poor student, but I'd always get good grades on papers I wrote. English and math were my two decent subjects. And the wonderful thing was teachers give you assignments, and I could write them. We'd have all semester to do them. I'd do them the night before, and I'd get an A on them. So I just had a little bit of natural ability, which didn't help me when I tried to pursue it, because when you're not writing something that's assigned to you by a teacher, it's hard work. The blank page can be the toughest thing to lift.
Understood. So when you began writing, would you say that there were influences on your work from previous books you've had read, writers, and if so, would you be able to elaborate on that a bit for us?
Sure. My favorite writers were mainly the Southern Gothic writers. Faulkner. I was a huge Faulkner fan, and then I gravitated from him to Flannery O'Connor and Carson McCullers. I loved the way McCullers depicted loneliness. She was just brilliant at that. And then from there, I found Hemingway. I was completely almost self-taught. I didn't have very many good classes in high school where we had to teach us stuff, where we had to read these things. So I found Hemingway. I found them all kind of on my own. And that's why my education is still incomplete. But anyhow, those were the ones that influenced me the most when I started writing. And good God, I started trying to copy Faulkner, which is the worst guy in the world to try and copy, because he had those run-on stream of consciousness sentences, and I still fall into that trap every now and then of writing these ridiculously long sentences. So anyhow, so those are my influence. And then when it comes to writing comic stuff like this, growing up, I was a huge Woody Allen fan, and I particularly loved his short essays he used to write for the New Yorker, and so that's why to this day I still write kind of 40% or so comic and 60% serious stuff.
That's interesting. So would you say one is harder to write than the other, comic versus serious?
Well, the thing that's hard about writing comic stuff is getting your own voice in there, not because comic writing depends so much on cadence and timing. And it's easy just to go in rhythm, boom, 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 rhythm, kind of a comedian's spitting out the jokes. So if you want to write something that's a little more lengthy and a little more substantive, that's also comic, it's very difficult. And that's why Kurt Vonnegut, I think, is such a great writer, because he could be very comic, very funny while describing something that's very serious.
It's hard to do that, indeed. Yeah. So you have another piece there?
Sure, I have this one's very, very short. This one's really nothing more than a journal entry, but for some reason I liked it. I call it Intersection. I'm going to take a swig of water real quick. Okay. A couple of months ago, on a warm August afternoon, I watched a hummingbird from my window. It was smaller than my thumb, and it hovered and levitated, the motor of its tiny wings a blue blur, as I look for nectar in the wildflowers just outside of my cabin. Around here, you don't see hummingbirds in the winter. They migrate south to Mexico and Panama, as far as 2,500 miles. Hormonal changes brought about by decreasing amounts of daylight tell them when it is time to go. For some, the migration path takes them over the Gulf of Mexico, or about 500 miles of nonstop flying. Predators are numerous, from the many birds of prey to bats and cats, to even spiders and insects. Hummingbirds typically migrate alone. I put this down so I don't forget about the hummingbird and the blue blur of its wings and the long and perilous and solitary journey that brought it, on that late summer afternoon, to the wildflowers by my cabin at the precise time I happened to look out my window.
Very nice. Very nice. So you happened to be looking out the window and saw this and decided to write the piece?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, hummingbirds are amazing animals. Like I say, smaller than my thumb, but they're capable of flying 500 miles without stopping. It just amazed me. And that this one had come from that distance to be right outside my window.
So the fact that you were inspired to write that piece by looking out through the window at the hummingbird, how would you say most of your pieces come about in terms of, do you sit down and say, I'm going to write something. I'm not sure what it is yet, but I'm going to sit down with the discipline, we used that word earlier, and write a piece? Or do you typically have an experience like you just had with the hummingbird and you decide, I'm going to write about that I'm inspired by this event?
Well, like I said, that was like a journal entry, so that was something that happened, and I just wrote it down. I haven't really done anything else with it since then, but I revisit it now and then. So I think what emerges from things like that are themes in my more serious writing. So the temporary nature and the kind of random occurrence of fate, bringing things together, I think that's been kind of a theme that I've written about in my novels. So I think that's what's valuable about pieces like that. As far as my process of writing, I've been terribly blocked now for the last few months. That's why going back looking at these older pieces has been very good for me, I think. Hopefully it'll get me started again.
I see. I think that's rather common that writers go through periods of writer's block, and even the best. In fact, we often don't see. We'll have a favorite writer. Maybe one of mine might be John Irving, or but he takes a long time to bring out another book. And I know he's very disciplined about writing, but I think people just go through these natural experiences of writer's block, as you've just described. Who are some of the writers you are reading today that influence your work, perhaps?
We'll see how much they influence my work, but I just finished reading my first Cormac McCarthy novel.
Which one?
No Country for Old Men. And I'd seen the movie, and looking at the movie now, I've never seen a movie succeed and be that faithful to the novel. The movie is like a graphic representation of the novel, almost word for word. But it's a great book. And then I recently read, oh boy, I'm drawing a blank here, Ironweed by William Kennedy. And
I read that as well, on your recommendation.
Did you enjoy it?
I struggled through it.
Yeah.
I really did.
I can see that I struggled through part of it too, but then parts of it were just, to me, were hauntingly beautiful. And other parts were so. But so those are two most recent authors I've read.
Very good, very good. And do you read poetry ever? And if you do or have, I'm interested in which poets might be some of your favorites.
My mom was a huge poetry fan, and she read a lot of the women poets, like Anna St. Vincent Millay and Emily Dickinson. But she didn't read much modern stuff. But I'd read some of the things my mom had read and enjoyed them, but I still have trouble. And I've read some of the beat poets too. I've read Ginsberg and enjoyed that immensely. But but I don't feel like I know enough about the art form to really. It's like I haven't cracked the code yet. Movies and novels, I can rip them apart really well. Not right now, but poetry's still kind of foreign to me.
I think that is a common experience. There is almost and it almost depends on the poems. Some are more accessible, I'll use that word, than others. And I think as children growing up and reading poetry in schools, I think oftentimes we're kind of, our growth is immediately stunted because we don't have accessible poems, enough of them to read to understand that this can be very easy too, and not so darn difficult as it sometimes seems when we're in school. So I certainly understand that. You have another piece to read, correct?
Sure. Hey, this is a very short 2-page thing that I wrote for my first novel, Ojibwe Valley. And this is one of my favorite pieces of writing I've ever done, but I could not make it fit in a book. So I never made it to the book. But I saved it anyhow. So I saved it and I call it July 4th. So here goes. Fireflies blinked on and off in the front yard as Bernard slipped through the screen door onto the front porch. It was almost dark, headlights winding down Ojibwe Valley Road toward the mighty Casey's. Everybody else was inside, in the family room, silently staring at the television, their minds wandering to wherever their minds took them, numb from the news they were still trying to absorb. The 4th of July was the last thing on their mind. Outside, a warm breeze blew from the south. Bernard had his jacket on, but knew it wouldn't be required as he got to the road and started walking toward the bridge. The plan was for him to wear his American Legion uniform, being the 50th 4th of July since the end of World War I. Bernard was to stand with the other 2 surviving veterans of the war living in the valley, but that didn't seem important anymore. What was important to Bernard was to trace the steps he had taken 15 years earlier. He walked along the road, and before it got to the junction with County Highway H, where the bridge was closed down, where cars were already lined on both sides of the road, where parents sat in lawn chairs along the riverbank and on the bridge, where kids ran in the tall grass waving sparklers, the sounds of their shouts and laughter echoing the warm mid-air. Bernard, like he did 15 years earlier, stepped off the road into the quiet shadows cast by the trees and onto the rutted tractor path that led to the rolling hayfields. He ducked under the barbed wire fence and walked on the path parallel to the highway until it turned to the west and went uphill. He climbed the hill, feeling a slight tightness in his 73-year-old thighs, until he got to the top. It was almost completely dark as he sat down in the tall grass and looked through the opening in the trees to the river and the bridge and the spot in the far banks where Jack Casey and his crew were getting ready to start the fireworks. He sat in the weeds, alone in the dark, the warm breeze in his face, his hands clasped around his knees, and watched as the fireworks started to explode. They lit up the sky right above him, and they were close enough that they lit up the empty grasses that surrounded him. "Wow," his 4-year-old grandson said, and after about the 5th explosion he added, "This is the best place, isn't it, Grandpa?" He could see his grandson, his little shadow, in the empty red and yellow flashes of light beside him. He thought of the trenches in the Argonne he'd made it home from, and he thought of the jungles in Vietnam his grandson didn't, and remembered the answer he gave 15 years ago. "Yes, it is," he replied. "It's the best place in the whole world."
Very nice, very nice. Now, did I understand correctly, is that part of a novel that you wrote?
Yeah, it was supposed to be. And I covered all the events that this one was reacting to in the novel, but I could not make this fit in it.
How interesting.
So these 2 pages had to...
So maybe that's a blessing. You get a separate piece.
Yeah.
Yes. So how did that piece come about right there? Where were you? Take us through to the point of you began writing that piece.
Well, I was telling a story about this older guy who had his grandson. When his grandson was young, his grandson was his shadow. They went everywhere together, and the grandson enlisted for service in Vietnam because of he admired his grandfather's service in World War I so much. and then he was killed in Vietnam. So the grandfather felt responsible for deluding him with these fake, things about war. And so that was the day after they got a notice that the grandson had been killed in action. And so that's, I wanted to show their relationship and show the grandfather the sense of guilt he was feeling.
That's a very interesting point of view to consider. Yeah. So is that completely fiction, or do you know of something in your...
No, it's completely fiction.
Okay. Very good. So I asked Darleen a question a little like this, and maybe I wanted to ask you as well. Do you feel like that since you began writing, did it change you in the way you looked at the world around you from the way you were before you began writing?
I think so. I think that's a very good question. I think I started seeing things more as material, more as stories. And like the piece in The Hummingbird, themes started to emerge. And themes not just in my work, but in my life. So I think between Parkinson's and the writing, I think I have a better understanding of who I am now, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense to me. Perfect sense, yeah. I think when we put our thoughts and reflections down on paper, we're staring at ourselves and part of ourselves that we didn't know even existed. I mean, at least I see it that way sometimes. So It came out, whether it's channeled or however it is, but we're actually looking at ourselves outside of ourselves, interestingly, I think, if that makes sense. Do you have another piece, Dave?
One more,
okay.
If you have time.
Absolutely, we have time. Thank you.
This is a very short story I wrote, and see if you can figure out what it's about. It's called Her Eyes Were Deep Green Puddles. It had rained during the night. The black pavement of the driveway was wet. She was standing at the window, looking out. Her eyes were deep green puddles. From the bottom of the stairway, in the dim early morning light, he could see her reflection in a window. "Are you ready?" he asked. She dabbed at her eyes with her shirt sleeve, turned to him, and, trying to smile, nodded yes. He shuffled across the room to her. "Let's go then," he said, barely louder than a whisper. He reached out his arms, and she slid between them and buried her head in his chest, her right hand coming to rest on his left shoulder. His hands round her waist, he pulled her close. Outside it was clear to the east, and the sky was lighting up, but they both knew that more rain was on the way. She started to cry. "I'm so sorry," she said, each word punctuated by harsh and loud sobs. She could feel his body shaking. "I never dreamed it'd come to this." No, we'll have none of that. He was still taller than her. That hadn't changed. That may have been the only thing that hadn't changed. He held her tight. Finally, she pulled back, still in his arms, but not as tight. She looked up at his face. His eyes were staring at the hallway behind her, urgent and unblinking. "Is it?" she started. He nodded yes, his gaze never leaving the hallway. She slowly and carefully pulled back, and he released her from their embrace, her eyes still fixated on the hallway. She looked at the hallway, even though she knew it was empty. She couldn't help it. Every time he saw him, she had to look, even though she knew he wasn't there. Maybe it was because every time something deep inside her, against all logic and reason, made her hope that this time he'd be there, that she would see him too. But she never would, and each time she felt foolish for having looked. "We'd better get going," he finally said, his eyes still fixed on the empty hallway. "Okay," she said, as she picked up his bag and moved toward the front door. He remained in the same spot in the living room, still staring at the empty hallway. Her hand on the doorknob, she turned to him. "How does he look today?" she asked. "He looks good," he replied. "He looks good." He turned his head and looked at the door, at his wife, and forced a feeble smile around his mouth. His eyes didn't participate. They remained empty. Then, with a sudden jerk, he became unfrozen and turned and shuffled across the living room to the door. As she opened it, He took one last look toward the hallway. Then he took her hand, and they walked out to the driveway to the parked car. She put his bag in the trunk. Then she opened the passenger door. As he folded up his stiff and creaking body and got in, it started to rain, a slight drizzle. Tiny drops of water bounced off of the pavement. Her eyes were deep green puddles.
A lot of delicate emotion in there.
Yeah.
So did you say that I didn't quite catch what you said about short story related to that? Can you is that a short story?
Yeah.
Okay, got
very,
it.
very
Okay,
short story.
I was slightly confused. I get it now. My mistake. So tell us about how that you came to write that.
Well, this is me. I wrote this a few years ago. At the time, I didn't know as much as I do now, but it's me dealing with the reality of Parkinson's. At some point, dementia is going to likely set in, and at some point, I'll probably be institutionalized. Not in the type of institution everybody thought I'd be in, but so it's kind of me coming to terms with that, imagining what that's going to look like. So don't mean to be depressing. And
No, not at all. No, not at all. I think that's a beautiful piece, and your emotions are right there on the page and expressed quite nicely. So, very good, very good. Now you mentioned, Dave, that you have a couple of novels. I think. Did you say that?
yeah, one I self-published, and another one I just finished about a year ago, and I'm shopping around now.
Okay, very good, very good. So you're in the process of trying to commercialize those two novels?
At least the second one, yeah.
At least the second one. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And by the way, I failed on that point with you, Darleen. Do you have any pieces? Do you have some published work as well in writing?
Yes, I've had 2 short stories published. Didn't get paid for them other than in copies of book, but
But you got paid in a different way.
yeah.
Just the reward of knowing
it
that
was
somebody
quite
wanted.
exciting.
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm sure. And what were they published in?
The first was published in a literary journal called the Great Lakes Review. It was Great Lakes Review, right? And the other was an online publication called Bird's Thumb, which is kind of nice. Bird's Thumb, in that you could always access it because, it's online, so it's going to live forever.
Oh, you're
You
memorialized.
can go look in the archives, and there it is. Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
Very good. Short stories.
There are 2 short stories.
And if I can shift a little bit here, that's an interesting question to me. Short stories are so you have poetry, then you have short stories, and then you have novels, fiction, short novels, even if you want to go down that sort of hierarchy. And in between short stories and poems, you have other kinds of poems that are longer and more narrow. But do you find tell us about that short story medium, because some people have a difficult time writing short stories. They're pretty difficult at times because you don't have a lot of words to work with. You have to get the point, drive the point home more quickly. What tell us about writing in the short story?
That's so true, and I've purposely set out to write a really, really short story, 500 words, and I couldn't do it. The closest I came was 1,000 words. The shorter you go, the harder it is. So you're exactly right in saying that. It's hard to get the story across. I really admire people who can do that, tell a complete moving story in 500 words. I can't.
Why did you select 500 words? Was that a challenge to you?
It was a challenge. Yeah.
It was your own challenge.
I've read that. I've read people that can do that, and I thought, well, I'm going to see if I'm one of them, and I'm clearly not.
You are. You published 2 pieces, so keep trying.
Not in 500 words, so yeah.
And Dave, what comments do you have about writing in the short story mode?
I think I think it's the most misunderstood form of writing, except for maybe poetry. Because I think everybody thinks of short stories as something to knock off quickly, and I think you have to put as much time in. You put as much time in a single short story as someone else puts in a novel. But I think most people look at it as kind of knockoff work, and it's not. It's very difficult, like Darleen said.
I think sometimes actually films, movies, when they try to take, you brought up the Cormac McCarthy book and how loyal it is, but so often it's sort of like that same reductionist activity that goes on in a movie when they're trying to put a novel on screen and they have to cut a bunch of stuff out, and how it hangs all together with when you cut so much out is a little slightly analogous. So I think one of our participants I mentioned earlier, and thank you again for listening to Speaking of Our Words, was unable to show up. So I have a couple of poems that I thought I would read toward the end of our session here. And this first poem was written back in the 70s by a great poet of the last century, James Wright, who was born in 1926. And this is called Autumn Begins in Martins Ferry, Ohio. And I'm going to make the remark here at the beginning that James Wright, like so many of those poets from who were born in the 20s, and there were about 40 of them that were really important, they became quickly saturated with iambic pentameter and strictly metered verse, and at some point they had to break out, like the Impressionist painters had to break away from their masters. And so that's where free verse started to really emerge, and so this is very much in a free verse, unrhymed pattern. Autumn begins in Martins Ferry, Ohio. In the Shreve High football stadium, I think of Polacks nursing long beers in Tiltonsville, and gray faces of Negroes in the blast furnace at Benwood, and the ruptured night watchmen of Wheeling Steel dreaming of heroes. All the proud fathers are ashamed to go home. Their women cluck like starved pullets, dying for love. Therefore, their sons grow suicidally beautiful at the beginning of October and gallop terribly against each other's bodies. And this is a poem by James Wright, also of a quite different mood, written around the same time frame, called A Blessing. Just off the highway to Rochester, Minnesota, twilight bounds softly forth on the grass, and the eyes of those two Indian ponies darken with kindness. They have come gladly out of the willows to welcome my friend and me. We step over the barbed wire into the pasture where they have been grazing all day alone. They ripple tensely. They can hardly contain their happiness that we have come. They bow shyly as wet swans. They love each other. There is no loneliness like theirs. At home once more, they begin munching the young tufts of spring in the darkness. I would like to hold the slenderer one in my arms, for she has walked over to me and nuzzled my left hand. She is black and white. Her mane falls wild on her forehead, and the light breeze moves me to caress her long ear that is delicate as a skin over a girl's wrist. Suddenly I realize that if I stepped out of my body, I would break into blossom. And I have one last piece to read by a poet, W.S. Merwin, who was born in 1927 from that same era. For the anniversary of my death. Every year, without knowing it, I have passed the day when the last fires will wave to me, and the silence will set out, tireless traveler, like the beam of a lightless star. Then I will no longer find myself in life as in a strange garment, surprised at the earth and the love of one woman and the shamelessness of men. As today writing, after 3 days of rain, hearing the wren sing and the falling cease, and bowing, not knowing to what. You are listening to Speaking of Our Words, and we are at the close of this session. I would like to ask, do any of our guest writers, Dave Gourdoux and Darleen Coleman, have websites or blogs they wish to share with us?
I don't.
I have one. I haven't updated it now in a couple of months. It's driveled by Dave. It's DJ Gourdoux, GOURDOUX.com.
A little self-deprecating title, huh? Okay. Very good, very good. And I do not have one myself. In closing remarks, I'd like, before we do that, I'd like to ask either Darleen or Dave to tell us about the Kenosha Writers Guild meeting when we have that, and if you could just give our audience some information about that.
Okay, the Writers Guild has open meetings every third Thursday of every month. We meet at Carthage College in room 196 of the Straz building. We are free, open to the public. We encourage writers of all levels and genres to come join us and share their work with us.
Great. Thank you very much, Darleen. This show is a production of the Kenosha Writers Guild. If you have any questions or comments or wish to participate on this program, please visit KenoshaWritersGuild.com and come to one of our meetings. Please visit the Facebook and YouTube pages for this show, Speaking of Our Words, and feel free to leave a comment. Thanks to Dave Cole and WGTD, Steve Brown and Nita Hunter, our engineer, Troy McDonald, Lisa Adamowitz-Kless, and the Kenosha Writers Guild. Thank you so very much to all our guests, Dave Gourdoux and Darleen Coleman. And I am Marshalll Smith. Remember, the world needs your poems and stories. We will see you again. Thank you for listening to Speaking of Our Words.